I'm Dr. Stephanie Rollins, Library Director, and it is my delight to welcome you to our AU Authors Connect. We are excited to have this series and share the work of AU authors and their research and connecting people with the research, because we don't always get time to read things. I'd love to read more. It's a sad tale of a librarian that doesn't get to read all the time, but I would love to share and highlight your work today. If you have a publication, please contact us, whether it's an article, a book, a paper. We'd love to do this multiple times a year, and we don't often make those connections with the schools to see what everybody's publishing, so please contact us. An event like this takes a ton of planning and coordination, so I'd be remiss if I didn't thank people, first of all, our fantastic authors for taking the time out and setting up and making sure they could be here today. Also, thanks to the event committee, Sandy Malati, also Emmy Cantrell, Tim Thomas, and also Michael Tate. And also thank you to the TLC, Doug, and I see Wayne here somewhere, for the technology support, and also Andrew. He's our go-to person. I'd be remiss if I didn't also thank Justin Chrysostom. Sorry, Justin, I always bungle your name. Justin Chrysostom. He has a surprise at the end for the authors. So thank you for the printing. And also, I'd like to thank Dr. Margaret Sankey. She is our partner over at the Office of Sponsored Programs, and she's fantastic about connecting authors and research in the library. So we're so happy to have her support as well. Today, we're featuring research by Dr. Jonathan Hunt, author of The Nuclear Club, Dr. Robert W. Hutchinson, author of After Nuremberg, American Clemency for Nazi War Criminals, and Dr. Bradley Podliiska, author of Fire Alarm, the investigation of the U.S. House Select Committee on Benghazi. If you would, please hold your questions till the end. We're going to have a question and answer session, so we'd appreciate that. So first up, we have Dr. Hunt. He is an assistant professor of strategy at Air Command and Staff College, or referred to as ACSC. Air War College, sorry. Air War College.
More classes to teach.
Gotcha. Fantastic. Air War College at Air University, Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Texas at Austin. He just drove in today, so thanks for being here. He holds a BA2 Liberal Arts Honors in History, Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, also from the University of Texas at Austin. His experience includes lecturing in global history at the University of Southampton, a Fox Fellow at Emory University, a Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow and Analyst at the RAND Corporation, and as the MacArthur Nuclear Security Fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. So lots of experience. His research interests include, of course, the Cold War, international history, nuclear policy, modern East Asian security, international law and institutions, and great power economic cooperation. So please welcome Dr. Hunt.
Thank you so much. And I would have said to hold your applause for the end. So in case I disappoint you, you don't have to waste them. Hopefully that won't be the case today, as the good director mentioned. And I want to start out by thanking my co-panelists, thanking Sandy as well for orchestrating all of this. I drove in from Austin over the course of the last 2 days. So I can't quite do the joke that, I flew in and my arms are tired, but my legs sure are from running all this way. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about my book published by Stanford University Press just a few months ago, November of 2022. Kind of excerpted or narrowed the scope somewhat, but the book itself really traces the arc of history of nuclear history from the earliest kind of inklings of the Manhattan Project through the opening for signature and eventual entry into force of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So there's been a considerable amount of work done on the treaty, done on what many scholars describe as the global nuclear non-proliferation regime to date. These histories have tended to fall into one of two camps. Either this was, as President Johnson once described it, a testament to reason, an effort by the international community, in essence, to find a way of mitigating tensions and finding some modicum of control over the further spread of nuclear weapons, envisaging that there would be an almost corresponding geometric rise in the likelihood of nuclear war, that this was really a project of all of humanity through the United Nations to bring some level of reason to bear upon the most powerful weapon ever devised. On the other hand, scholars have looked at the non-proliferation regime, at its inherent discrimination between the five sort of elected members of the official nuclear club. After 1971, this corresponds neatly with the five permanent members of the UN Security Council, also those who hold vetoes over Security Council resolutions, and have thus charged that the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the regime that it authorized is a kind of unequal treaty, akin to those imposed by imperial powers in the 18th, 19th, early 20th century, and in particular, a kind of imposed nuclear apartheid, according to one historian, Shane Maddock, very much alleging that the United States feared a world in which there was any more but one nuclear power, that being the United States. So over the course of, my dissertation work, time I spent at the University of Southampton, I finalized the book manuscript here in Montgomery. I have, spent, far too many hours in archives and personal papers and secondary sources, in many ways finding a way to kind of bridge these two narrative poles. On the one hand, this testament to reason, on the other hand, this nuclear apartheid. And so one character through which I've tried to elaborate what I describe as the creation of a voluntary but nonetheless discriminatory nuclear order is Walt Rostow. Rather famously or infamously, Lyndon Johnson, Special Assistant for National Security Affairs, National Security Advisor, especially for the point at which the Americanization of the Vietnam War was escalating and becoming an increasingly controversial bone of contention within American society. And it was in this context, May of 1968, about 4 months after the Tet Offensive, the Johnson administration and Vice President Humphrey looking forward to a very difficult presidential electoral contest with the Republican candidate Richard Nixon, that Walt Rostow stood before, an audience we're all pretty familiar with, the graduating class of the National War College. So graduating class of an Institute of Professional Military Education, many 05s and 06 who would, of course, go on to command troops in and around Southeast Asia. But on this occasion, Rostow asked them to kind of set their sights a little wider. And he asked what the world would look like, how long it would be until, quote, Germany, Japan, Italy, India, and others built the bomb. Now, even as he was giving this commencement address, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was under debate in a special session of the UN General Assembly, just about 100 miles north in Turtle Bay, Manhattan. And this US State Department, in order to, really bring up American attention and interest in this treaty, had, according to Rostow, described it as, quote, a good deed in a naughty world, as an instance of US-Soviet detente that might open up some doorway to a negotiated peace in Southeast Asia. Rostow begged to differ, stating that instead, the NPT was actually an attempt to halt the potential diffusion of power at its most important point. And for this reason, he and the White House were prepared to lock the United States, and in particular, its military expeditionary forces, into responsibility in the world right around the periphery of communist China and the Soviet Union on the toughest of all issues. So Rostow's diffusion of power speech, and in particular, identifying the spread of nuclear weapons as the most threatening manifestation of this diffusion, I think helps us open a window into what I describe the construction of a nuclear club, one that would preside over a world that would be rendered unequal, distinguished especially between the permanent members of the Security Councils wielding legitimately weapons of mass destruction, and on the other hand, the broad mass of the world's peoples and nations who would be, in many ways, multilaterally disarmed. Now, I describe this in particular concept, eventual strategy, and ultimately policy by two presidential administrations, that of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, as a kind of nuclear containment. One that proceeded in many ways alongside and in support of broader Cold War containment objectives, in particular to maintain a degree of control over events in what was at the time described as the Third World. So with this in mind, my book makes a set of arguments and then proceeds to substantiate these arguments. I am an historian by training, so international historian. I'll talk a little bit about my sources in a couple of slides, but with reference to these primary documentary sources. And the first claim that it makes is that whereas many political scientists, strategic scholars, going back as far as Bernard Brodie, have described the importance of a nuclear revolution, the ways in which it would ward off great power conflict, a kind of World War III, just as important, I think, for my research, was a kind of counter-revolution against the spread, the universalization of the implications of this nuclear revolution. And at least legally, the most important instance of this is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Secondly, the popularity of nuclear inhibitions in the middle of the Cold War, the 1960s, was driven not just by fears of spreading nuclear weapons, but of what were seen as irresponsible nuclear postures. And I'm happy to talk about this more. These are sort of terms of art that deserve more unpacking. Unfortunately, our time is limited here today. Catalytic and asymmetric postures which were popular with either less developed or less prosperous nations, in large part because big arsenals such as the Soviets and the United States were simply far more expensive to develop and maintain. Third, that while nuclear proliferation dynamics in the Middle East and South Asia were the chief concerns at the time, this is sort of a euphemistic way of saying Israel and India were probably the most concerning examples of near nuclear powers. The non-proliferation regime that was authorized by the NPT was really built atop a foundation of US power and in particular US military alliances. And so for this reason, it would prove far more robust and sustainable in East Asia as well as in Europe than it would in the Middle East, in South Asia, and ultimately Northeast Asia. Although the Korean story is, I'm going to save for another day. My book ends in 1969, 1970 for a reason, in part because it's already too long and nobody wants to read 1,500 pages. So last but not least, the book makes the claim that nuclear non-proliferation helps us to understand this connection between what John Lewis Gaddis dubbed the long peace of the Cold War, very much isolated to Europe, would extend somewhat into the post-Cold War, although events since 1914 in Crimea, in Ukraine more broadly, are slowly putting, maybe challenging this narrative. It helps to connect it to what historians describe as the global Cold War. This is Arnie Westad's formulation, the killing fields of the Cold War. This is Paul Chamberlain, more or less noting that while we tend to think of Cold War containment as producing peace, then in fact there were numerous civil wars, proxy conflicts, covert operations, of course, throughout Latin America, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. I think, this is somewhat what political scientists called the stability-instability paradox. This is more of a correlative argument than a causative argument, but I think there are some connections between global non-proliferation and the distinction between a long peace and a global Cold War. Now, I promised to talk just a little bit about the source base. This was the product of numerous archival visits, various countries around the world. Also worked with some co-authors, Joseph Terigian at American University, as well as Sergei Hutchinson, now at Johns Hopkins SAIS, were very kind in sharing a number of Soviet sources, Russian language Soviet sources, of course, before 2022. Nonetheless, there happened to be a bit of a window that allowed me to expand the evidentiary source base. Really, the backbone is U.S. presidential archives and national archives outside of College Park, Maryland, but also Mexican archives, French archives, British archives, Canadian archives, Irish archives. Little bit of trivia that you can read about more if you choose to buy a copy of my book. The first time a non-proliferation treaty was proposed was by the Republic of Ireland, and it was proposed by Foreign Minister Frank Aiken, who was a former commander in the Irish Republican Army. And so there is one frame that one could put to the non-proliferation treaty, that it was first proposed by a terrorist. which is something I haven't seen show up in. I keep thinking I'll start a talk with that at some point, but maybe connect it to some of my fellow authors' areas of studies. So what do we make of this big story? And it is a big, sprawling mess of a story that I do my best to find some elements of continuity and connection within. The first is the why. Why in the 1960s did a global nonproliferation regime seem so necessary? And I cite, first of all, the supply. There's simply more of it going around, a kind of state-led globalization, first through Atoms for Peace, thereafter through these kind of competitive Cold War peaceful nuclear assistance deals. But both superpowers, and there really is a kind of common interest and common campaign among them, even in the midst of the Vietnam War, seeking greater control over events in Europe and East Asia amid crises of legitimacy. For the Americans, caused by the Vietnam War, for the Soviets, caused by the Sino-Soviet split. Third, the international fears of how rising regional powers with risky nuclear postures, and here we can think of South Africa, we can think of Israel, we can think of India, we can even think of West Germany and Japan, could exacerbate post-colonial territorial disputes and revolutionary politics. And this is very much where the Chinese example was quite frightening for many policymakers. For the how, I very much draw attention to the importance of US hard power, but also economic power. So this would include the creation of voice opportunities in NATO, the creation of the McNamara Committee, a comparable institution in the US-Japan alliance, but also voice opportunities within the United Nations. The assurance that security commitments to US allies would cover various nuclear threats. And then lastly, American economic and technological preeminence, in particular, a near monopoly on fissile materials, enriched uranium in particular. This, of course, would be eroded by Urenco, rather famous, A.Q. Khan, would use many of the highly advanced high-speed centrifuges developed by this European consortium to catalyze proliferation programs in Pakistan and North Korea and a number of other states. This is a story of a Soviet Cold War policy that's in transition as well, looking increasingly toward Europe, eventually to the Helsinki Final Pact of 1975. And then lastly, the ways in which nuclear order and strategic deterrence were entangled. These things tend to be treated in isolation, especially at the United Nations. Every 5 years, the NPT states parties meet there, and there's very little said about US alliance security assurances, the US nuclear umbrella. But that, I think my research shows was integral to the creation of this regime. I am, I think, pretty close to 15 minutes. Oh, I have 40 seconds to get through this slide. So to what end? What have been the legacies of this non-proliferation regime? Keeping in mind it's a regime that's still active. It's a regime that authorizes legally sanctions against countries like the DPRK, like Iran. It's even authorized coalitions of the willing to wage preventive war in the name of nuclear peace. Well, the first is that the Vietnam War plays a kind of ambiguous role. It both catalyzes it. It's a story of President Johnson wanting to look like a nuclear peacemaker as college students on campuses around the country were chanting, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? The non-proliferation treaty really, he felt, helped his political legitimacy, but it also limited the scope. There was a window of opportunity for negative assurances, in essence saying states parties would not be threatened by the US nuclear deterrent, by the Soviet nuclear deterrent. This was scraped, essentially because the Joint Chiefs of Staff feared losing the nuclear option in Vietnam, as well as the Korean Peninsula. Secondly, that the reliance on existing alliance arrangements and nuclear security assurances reinforce stability. So this is that story of why you get a long peace in Europe, and to a lesser extent after Vietnam, a long peace in Asia, but not so much in the Middle East, not so much in South Asia, let alone Africa and Latin America. And then last but not least, as I previously alluded, these norms of laws would also, in many ways, create a superpowered imperial presidency, executive war powers that could be expanded to include the threat, a nuclear threat that was not the threat of use of nuclear weapons, but the mere ability the capacity to produce nuclear weapons would in time and there's some really interesting sources from the French Foreign Ministry, that this would create in the UN Charter a sort of loophole for great powers to wage preventive war in the name of global nuclear peace. So with that, I'll end about a minute over, so I apologize. Thank you for your patience, and I wish I could see what time I have remaining to my co-panelists today. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hunt. Next up, we have, if you advance the slide, we have Dr. Hutchinson. Okay, we're good. So Dr. Hutchinson is a professor of strategy and security studies at the School of Advanced Air and Space Power Studies, SAS, at Air University Maxwell Air Force Base. He received a BA in history from the University of Delaware and a PhD in modern European history from the University of Maryland. His research focuses on 20th century European political and military history, intelligence studies, and Holocaust and genocide studies. Prior to arriving at SAS, Dr. Hutchinson was a postdoctoral fellow in the Strategy and Policy Department at the United States Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. In addition to his current book, After Nuremberg, he is also the author of German Foreign Intelligence from Hitler's War to the Cold War, Flawed Assumptions and Faulty Analysis. Please welcome Dr. Hutchinson.
Thank you. Let's see here. Thanks all, everyone for coming. I'm really excited to be here. Before I begin, I want to play a brief clip from some newsreel footage from 1951, which, apart from having the voice of Newsreel Man, you'll hear that in a minute and recognize it. Because when we think of the Nuremberg trials, to the extent that we think of them at all, we have a certain visual picture in our mind of kind of a sober and somber courtroom, miserable-looking defendants with their simultaneous translation earphones on, the traumatic stories of witnesses and survivors of Nazi atrocities, mountains of documents and that sort of thing. But this very brief news clip is just as much a part of that legacy as the courtroom itself. I don't know if can you play this? Because I don't think my clicker will advance it. Okay, I could try. Yeah, mine just, it skips past the video.
It's playing here.
And I'll give this like 15 seconds, then I'll just move on.
How good is your newsreel voice?
Convicted at Nuremberg, they now walk out free men, granted a reprieve by the U.S. Army. They are greeted like heroes. The 29 include 4 Nazi generals and 7 munitions makers. Among these is Alfred Krupp, industrialist who made possible the war machine of Adolf Hitler, who himself once was jailed here, and here wrote Mein Kampf, his blueprint for world conquest.
And the sound awkwardly cuts out, which is fine. So that's Landsberg prison in the background. And the point is, this is visual documentation of about 30 Nazi war criminals experiencing pure joy and relief, reuniting with their families on the morning of February 3rd, 1951. They've been released from Landsberg prison years, if not decades, ahead of schedule. And so what you have here is a visual record of the aftermath of what many scholars and citizens alike in the United States still think of as a crowning achievement in international law and U.S. occupation policy. Barely a year and a half after the final verdict was delivered at the Nuremberg trials, you have a policy undercut, discarded, and abandoned. And so the question that animates my research is why? Why did this happen? How did this happen? Because we're all, in the secondary literature, we're all very familiar with the genesis of the Nuremberg trials, but there's much less attention paid to the legacy of them in terms of what happens to the prisoners themselves. And so after Nuremberg is a political and legal history of an American policy reversal. That's how I see it. Putting war criminals in prison and throwing away the key versus letting them out. And so how did this happen? So just very briefly to set the context, because there are several, Nuremberg is a term that's used loosely. The trials I'm talking about are the 12 Nuremberg successor trials that take place in occupied Germany from 1946 to 1949. This term you might find somewhat provocative, but I think it's apt, and it's liberal show trials. a series of liberal show trials that are deliberately implemented by the US occupation authorities under the US military, and they're meant to put the Nazi dictatorship on trial. So this is not the famous trial of the four powers of Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States trying people like Goering and Hess and all of that and hanging them afterwards. This is a series of trials orchestrated by the US Army against institutions of the German state. So judges, doctors, members of mobile killing units, military officers, civil servants. And the goal is to both demonstrate the criminality of Nazi governance and institutions across the board collectively, but also to try individuals for individual crimes within that broader context under US laws and normal criminal procedures. So the purpose of this is to rehabilitate the West German people. It's part of kind of a four-tiered occupation policy that involves decartelization, demilitarization, and reconstruction of German governance along kind of democratic Western lines, specifically in the Western occupation zones and the US occupation zone in particular. And what we have here is who is the object of rehabilitation, and this gets to questions we'll raise in a minute or two. When you think of criminal justice proceedings, the effort is rehabilitative towards the offender. At least that's kind of the consensus in the US system. Whereas here, the object of rehabilitation isn't initially the criminals themselves, it's the German people. By bearing witness to these highly public series of trials, by being confronted with masses of evidence about the criminality of their own state and the role that they played in it, the idea is that the German people themselves will be redeemed in a massive kind of educational effort orchestrated by Telford Taylor and his staff. So these are not ordinary men who had committed base acts of murder or assault in the heat of passion of battle and that sort of thing. These are kind of the systematic elites who instituted and implemented the Nazi regime's programs of genocide, plunder, theft, enslavement throughout the period of the regime. And so you have some numbers here from 46 to 49, 142 leading officials of the dictatorship are put on trial and convicted. 36 or so are acquitted for lack of evidence, not lack of evidence, but for insufficient evidence for the charges, indicating that these trials are in some objective sense fair, and we'll come back to that in a minute. By January of 1951, 89 remain in Landsberg prison. This is because a number of those from 142 to 89 had been given shorter sentences of less than 5 years, mostly your leading industrialists and some other minor officials in the civil service and that sort of thing. But of these 89, 78 received clemency from the US government, the High Commission for Occupied Germany, HICOG, run by John J. McCloy, and all are released from prison in 1958. So how did this happen is the animating question here, but also what is the significance of these events for the greater kind of political, legal, and moral legacy of the Nuremberg trials? Because when we think about a trial is a process. It is the beginning through the verdict, but also the legacy of this, particularly when it comes to issues of international law, how this is remembered, how the aftermath influences the public's views of whether these trials are legitimate or not, will have a long-standing impact not only on West German coming to terms with the past of the Nazi dictatorship, but also whether or not international law is ever resorted to again as a recourse for trying crimes against humanity and that sort of thing. And in fact, it is set aside until Rwanda and Kosovo, and only then it is revived with some criticism of how these trials took place because of what happens afterward. So when I first started this project, I thought the answer to why this happened would have to do with your traditional Cold War foreign policy interpretation. West Germany was an ally, essentially, that had to be bought and paid for by a loosening of unpopular occupation policies, right? And so the scholarship is kind of clear on this when it comes to invoking the Nuremberg trials and West German rearmament in the 1950s. You have a very savvy politician, Konrad Adenauer, extracting as much leverage, using his limited leverage to extract as many concessions as he can from not a desperate US government, but a US government very concerned with cementing Germany into the anti-Soviet alliance, particularly as the Cold War hardens in the early 1950s. That's what I thought I was going to find. That's when I looked at the records of the prison administration, HICOG, State Department, the US Army. That's not what I found, actually. I found that this was a rather segmented, kind of cut off an internal process where it is animated by principally legal questions of what is fairness and what is justice, and rather a fair amount of navel gazing by American lawyers and civil servants and politicians about without reference to the Soviet Union. And I'll talk more about that in a second. So what are the questions that American High Commissioner John J. McCloy and his staff are dealing with when they're confronted with this issue of the Nuremberg war criminals? When McCloy takes his office in mid-1949, the trials have been concluded, and Lucius Clay, the military governor of Germany, who McCloy is partially replacing, had gone through and verified the validity of pretty much every single sentence, right? So you have this firm starting point in 1949 of the trials are over, the war criminals are imprisoned, and what now? Well, there's a fair amount of questions that are left unresolved. Are war criminals first and criminals second, or the other way around? And this matters in the sense that, well, what's the purpose of keeping these people in jail? Is it to deter future bad actors? Is it to rehabilitate them? Is it to extract some level of punishment? Are they entitled to time off their sentences for good behavior? Are they entitled to medical parole? Are they entitled to parole in general, much like any other criminal would be in the American justice system? And some of you are already kind of nodding your head as this. You can see how bureaucratically, once you start asking these questions and you set up an internal mechanism to resolve them, this process ends up being self-sustaining. Is American justice the right to a fair trial, or does it also involve the right to appeal a trial's verdict? These are two fundamentally different things. And if it is bound up in the idea of American justice means the ability of anyone to appeal a verdict, well, how many appeals did they get? It turns out the answer that a lot of these folks come up with is they should be entitled to appeal their verdict over and over in perpetuity forever until they are granted some measure of clemency or release, is essentially what happens. You have to remember that there's no legal mechanism set up at the Nuremberg trials to hear appeals. It's unprecedented. There is no international appellate court for war criminals. And so even though the US military occupation government has found the sentences valid and confirmed them, and even though all the appeals that the prisoners make to the US Supreme Court were summarily rejected, this is seen by McCloy and his staff as insufficient and fundamentally unfair, right? To prove, and this is where the Cold War context does kind of come in, to prove the validity of American justice as opposed to Soviet totalitarianism and show trials and that sort of thing, you have to, as a matter of not only legal best practices, but it's a moral imperative to allow the German war criminals to appeal their sentences. However, by setting up an appeal process through a mechanism of clemency and parole panels, by essentially turning clemency panels into appellate courts, this is a problem, I found, because it turns out that the role of an appellate court versus a clemency panel is fundamentally different. These are two different things. So an appellate court will hear evidence from both sides and weigh it and judge it, whereas a clemency panel acting as an appellate court will skim the summary verdict of the trial and hear a petition from the defendant. There are no lawyers in the room, no witnesses, no evidence, nothing rehashed. It's not adversarial, and so it's a one-sided affair that privileges the voices of the convicted criminals. Moreover, the process, as I said, is mutually reinforcing, as prisoners could apply as many times as they wanted, and every act of clemency and parole was used by those still in prison to justify future acts of clemency and parole. And moreover, these kind of US initiatives ultimately captured administratively the British and the French governments, leading to them setting up similar panels and institutions in their zones of occupation, which led to them emptying their prisons. Because again, out of this concern of fairness and justice, if the United States is acting this way, then the British and French are ultimately kind of brought along. And in case you're wondering how far this goes in terms of the rationalizations and even verging into the kind of farcical, the last three hard cases that are released in 1958 are essentially Einsatzgruppen mass murderers. And the justification that the US government gives and the State Department signs off on for releasing them in 1958 is that their continued imprisonment, they're all there for life terms, would constitute cruel and unusual punishment because everyone else had already gone home. And so it would be discriminatory against these three people to keep them in jail, even though they showed no remorse for their crimes and were responsible for the deaths of thousands of people. As this process played out, another argument I make in the book is that it was a contested process. The takeaway in the West German public sphere and all around the world actually. There's tremendous outcry in Britain, Israel, as you can imagine, France, the Soviet Union for different reasons, and even domestically in the United States about this process where luminaries of international law and justice all around the world accuse the United States of turning its back on international law. And here you have a political cartoon from the Washington Post at the time of kind of an affable US High Commissioner McCoy letting the arms magnate Alfred Krupp out of jail while a gleeful Soviet propagandist takes pictures in the background because, oh, how they're going to use this to beat the drum of the United States freeing the last generation of fascists in order to wage a fascist war against the Soviet Union, particularly given the context of Korea at the time. These are some parole files of two individuals. I want to briefly move along and give you one example to stand for all the others. His picture is not up here because he didn't have a file that was as good as this one. But think about this individual, Walter Bloom, who commanded a mobile killing unit, among other wartime activities, in Sonderkommando 7A of Einsatzgruppen B from May to August of 1941. In these few months operating in Belarus, he was responsible for ordering and carrying out the executions of innocent people, at least 200 of them. He admits to 200, probably over 1,000 based on documentary evidence. Some are Jews, some are non-Jews. They're all innocent. They're not partisans. This is just part of the early liquidation program as a matter of course. Walter Bloom was sentenced to death at the Einsatzgruppen trial in 1948, partly based on his own testimony, that trial, that he had ordered these murders and carried them out and committed them because he had received orders to do so, and he saw no particular problems with these orders. He was granted clemency, however, to 25 years from a death sentence by McCoy in 1951, based on a clemency board recommendation because Bloom claimed that his command was so brief, just from May to August, because he didn't like what he was doing and begged for a transfer. There was no evidence that he had done this. There was no paperwork, there was no corroborating evidence, but the clemency panel was not equipped to investigate that or subpoena eyewitnesses or anything of that nature. It didn't have the resources to do so, so it took his word for it. And thus, they actually recommended a sentence reduction to 20 years, but McCoy decided to 25 was a bit better. And that was in 1951. He was unanimously granted parole in 1954, however, receiving a file like this, on the basis that he was a model prisoner, well-behaved, and there was some evidence that he had bettered himself while inside prison because he had taken up some courses in filing and clerking and that sort of thing. And also a number of other Einsatzgruppen commanders had recently been paroled themselves, so it would be cruel to keep him in prison while the others were free, even not taking into account the difference in level of crime, evidence, or testimony that had imprisoned him in any case. On a visit to Bloom's home in 1955, his parole officer found him bitter. He was working as a law clerk. He had been a lawyer before the war, and he was very upset that his parole conditions barred him from resuming his legal practice after the war, and this was an ongoing punishment. But most galling to Bloom, he specifically complained to his parole officer, and this is noted in the records, that he resented having to take orders now in 1955 from the type of people who shirked their duty during the war. He had carried out what had been demanded of him, and other people had run away or refused to do it, and now he was subservient to them, and he didn't appreciate it or understand it. So this is a man with no remorse, no recognition of the legitimacy of his trial or the fact that his wartime activities murderously had constituted crimes at all. But he had a job, he lived with his family, so he's rehabilitated in the eyes of the State Department and the US government. And so this is part of the process of when I talk about in the book of undermining the legacy of Nuremberg, right? Nuremberg does not finish in 1949. It is continuously litigated and relitigated again and again, not just by the war criminals, but by the West German government and the US government. And I'll conclude briefly because I'm over time by a minute already, but this is by my own reckoning, I think. So this is a number of stories about Landsberg prison and the war criminals. It's a story about justice and its contested meanings of the neglected moral dimensions of foreign policy. Was this the right thing to do? But more importantly, was this the just thing to do? Is this justice? A number of American lawyers would argue that yes, it was. And they're not, that's one interpretation. There are other interpretations at the time where luminaries in international law, Telford Taylor, Eleanor Roosevelt, human rights officials, drastically panned the US decisions to free these people. It's a story about patron-client relationships. The United States could do whatever it wanted as far as the German war criminals went. The West German government didn't need to pressure them, couldn't pressure them, had no leverage over them. But the United States acted as it did anyway because it was principally concerned with this internal narrative of making sure that justice was done. It's about a domestic dimensions of international kind of a controversial policy. That some of the Cold Warriors do play a role here. Joseph McCarthy held some hearings before he becomes famous as Joseph McCarthy. There's some lurid accusations that the U.S. Army has tortured German prisoners in different trials, and so what starts the ball rolling on this process of re-examining the sentences has to do with a lot with domestic concerns coming out of the early Cold War, but not the foreign policy concerns about rearmament and checking the Soviet menace with West German troops. And it's a story about fragile precedents of war crimes prosecutions and international law and undermining the perceptions of legitimacy of war crimes trials. It didn't have to be this way. The four-power International Military Tribunal kept its prison open, staffed, and functional to 1987 because the Cold War prevented them from any power from unilaterally closing it. Because the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain couldn't come to an accord on this, Rudolf Hess, even though he's 90 years old and running around, it's kind of farcical. He's still serving out his full sentence. At a modest expense and a very low cost of political capital, the US government could have done the same thing, but chose not to for various reasons. And secondly, when there is a revitalized interest in prosecuting war crimes in West Germany in the 1950s and 60s, they turn to domestic law because this is so discredited in their eyes. The last data point I'll leave you with, which is kind of the moral of the story, is that John J. McCloy is not a monster. He's very concerned actually with maintaining the legitimacy of these trials in the eyes of the West German public that he oversees. And that's one of his motivating factors for showing that the trials are fair, that the Americans are open to admitting they made mistakes and freeing people and that sort of thing. But at the end of his tenure and at the end of the occupation, the legacy of this process is that more West Germans reject the legitimacy of the trials than when McCloy started. And so forever, this kind of adds to the poison of the well of victor's justice in occupied Germany. And there's a lot more I could go into, but I wanted to do kind of a talks. So thank you very much for your attention. It's a pleasure to share my work with you.
Thank you so much. So next up, we have Dr. Podliiska. He is currently an assistant professor of military and security studies at Air Command Staff College at Air University, Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama. And prior to this interesting history, not all the authors, but before arriving at Maxwell, he was an investigator for the U.S. House Select Committee on Benghazi, and he also had 20 years of experience with the CIA. So that's fascinating. He holds a doctorate in political science focusing on international relations from Texas A&M, and is a graduate of the National Security Studies program. His research interests include national security, foreign policy, military conflicts, decision strategy, congressional oversight, and military planning. He's also the author of Acting Alone, a scientific study of American hegemony and unilateral use of force decision making. So please welcome Dr. Podliiska.
Well, thank you. I first wanted to thank the staff for putting this together, and then also thank my co-panelists. So the way I normally start this is with Benghazi. I simply throw out questions to the audience. What have you heard about Benghazi? And I get a lot of stuff back, also including a lot of partisan talking points back. What I usually do not get back is this was a failed hostage rescue mission. I don't get back terms such as Con Plan 0300. You never hear the name Jake Sullivan, who played a big part in this. And so this is really an exploration of how we got to this point in time where you have a national tragedy where 4 Americans are killed, including the U.S. ambassador, and you can't really talk about this stuff. If you want to quickly become a pariah or PNG at a cocktail party, bring up Benghazi. And so for me, this is a study of how we got to this point where we can't actually study tragedies without putting it through a partisan narrative. And so one half of the book is how we actually got to this point with fundamental reforms in Congress. And then the second part of the book is what actually Benghazi story is, the new facts that weren't told to you, because the story has basically been told by politicians, specifically 10 congressional committees. Standard disclaimer, these views are my own, not those of the U.S. government, U.S. Air Force, and perhaps most importantly, and certainly not those of Congress. We're going to talk about the history, a taxonomy, how a political party actually conducts a congressional investigation, including to how they maintain over leadership and staff to ensure a partisan outcome of that investigation. Going to look at the Benghazi Committee investigation. On the surface, it's going to seem very, very comprehensive. I believe the final report was 891 pages, 24,000 pages of document in total produced by Congress, 22,000 by the Benghazi Committee alone. So it seems on the surface, once again, complete, comprehensive, all that. However, I'm going to conclude with some stuff that was missed that's going to actually make you question, have we heard the legitimate story about what happened in Benghazi, Libya. So kind of the history of congressional investigations. Now, this is not a recent phenomenon that the president and Congress fight over congressional oversight. Going back to 1792, President Washington is going to lead the St. Clair expedition, which I believe to this day, in terms of casualty rate, and close to 90% casualties, complete and total disaster. Congress at the time is going to say, President Washington, turn over the papers for the expedition. We want to see why this was such a massive failure. President Washington is going to fight back. So this long history of this, but there's fundamental shifts in Congress, and starting with Watergate, which I call the critical incident, is kind of this adversarial role from Congress. They're going to start with it seems very on the surface, a very innocuous change. The committee chairs are no longer going to be selected based on seniority after Watergate. They're going to be based on party leadership and who party leadership wants in that committee chair role. And this is going to take away the independence of the committee chair. So I actually have a case study in the book where I talk about Vietnam War and how a lot of these representatives and senators had an independence from the Johnson administration to voice criticisms of the war. But the paradigm shift is going to be Newt Gingrich in 1994. He's going to run a campaign contract with America. He has decided the way for the Republicans to take back the House is to run elections as a national election. So you no longer, as a Republican, you're no longer running to represent your district, you're running to represent the Republican Party. And in order to do so, you have to sign this contract with America. Republicans are going to use this to great success. One of the biggest landslides in American history. Newt Gingrich is going to come into office and say, got it, we are passing legislation to basically ensure the permanency of contract with America. And here's a legislation the Senate is going to follow suit. Several key pieces, which on the surface might seem innocuous again, however, they're not. Here you have party leadership, once again, authorizing who's going to be the committee chair. And I'll get into how this is important later. You're going to have 1/3 of the staff cut. So Gingrich is going to make the point, we've got to cut the bureaucracy. But this is essentially going to take off the research arm of Congress when it comes to investigations. Going to remove the minority party from deliberations. And if party leadership doesn't like what a committee is doing, it can simply set up task forces to go around the committee to introduce legislation to the floor. So why would Congress take on this adversarial role to the White House? And the whole thing is getting reelected. If you're a Republican, you represent the Republican Party. If you're a Democrat, you represent the Democratic Party. If your party controls both the White House and Congress, it's in your interest to band together with your fellow party member and basically stifle or block investigations. And so we see with unified government, where one party owns both the White House and Congress, investigations by Congress basically almost go to nil. Example here is the Iraq War. 71% of Republicans gave absolutely zero speeches critical of Bush's handling of the Iraq War. However, the Democrats, 33% of them gave 10 or more speeches critical of the Iraq War. However, if your party does not own the White House and you want to take the White House back, it is in your interest to become an adversary to the White House, more specifically to drag down the poll numbers of your rival presidential candidate. And the reason you do this is because it's effective. For every 20 days of hearings you have on a rival presidential candidate, you're going to drag down their poll numbers by 2.5%. So now, how does this all work? If there's a tragedy, if there's a crisis that Congress wants to investigate, Congress has basically one of two choices. It can have it assign the investigation to a committee to investigate, or it can set up a commission to investigate the issue. Depending on the type of crisis, so police patrol is kind of a routine oversight investigation of the executive branch. So for example, if the DOD is charging $600 for a wrench and it comes out in an audit, Congress can introduce legislation, DOD knock it off with charging $600 for a wrench. However, as I said, the staff has been cut. Congress no longer has this kind of routine, or this is diminished in terms of police patrol investigations, because they don't have this research arm as much anymore. They've moved much more towards fire alarm investigations. And this is where a crisis happens, such as Benghazi. Congress says, oh, you're the opposite party. Americans are dead. We're going to investigate. And this has become much more the norm now. And so this is the dual meaning of the title for the book. The mission compound in Benghazi was set on fire, and this is also a fire alarm type of investigation. And the reason you're going to conduct the fire alarm investigation, once again, is to increase your partisan brand, increase your chances of your party either taking over Congress or taking over the White House. And the way you're going to ensure a party outcome is by selecting leadership that's loyal to you, meaning that do they vote with your party when it comes to legislation, and also staff who are going to be vetted through prior Capitol Hill experience. So if you've proven that you're a party loyalist to the party, you're going to get plum investigative assignments. If you want to actually look at who they're investigating, the hint here is going to be the rival presidential candidate in terms of investigation. Okay, so now the actual Benghazi attack itself, and all these findings are from the Benghazi committee. So just a little bit of background history here. 9:42 p.m., the state diplomatic mission compound in Benghazi, Libya, is overrun. There's a CIA annex about a mile away. They're going to respond to that. Basically arrive at the diplomatic compound, take those personnel back. At this point, Ambassador Stevens, information officer Sean Smith are dead. Ambassador Stevens is missing. And this is going to be crucial for senior officials back in Washington that Ambassador Stevens is missing. They're going to arrive back at the annex. Eventually, that annex is going to come under attack. A team from Tripoli is going to fly in to reinforce the annex. Soon after that team arrives, there's going to be a mortar attack on the annex. These guys are going to work with the militia in Benghazi itself, get transported to the Benghazi airport, fly to Tripoli. About 24 hours later, they're in Germany on a C-17. Now in Washington, President Obama is notified within an hour and a half of the attack. He happens to have a meeting scheduled with Secretary Panetta and Chair Joint Chiefs of Staff Dempsey at the White House, a prearranged meeting. Obama's going to issue what seems to be a very, very clear order at this meeting. Do everything you can to save American lives. Less than 1 hour later, Panetta's going to arrive back at the Pentagon with Dempsey. They're going to meet with U.S. AFRICOM Commander Ham, who happens to be in Washington. This order, do everything you can, use all the resources available to save American lives, is going to be mistranslated into this is a hostage rescue. Ambassador Stevens has been taken hostage. Subsequently, there's going to be an interagency meeting somewhere on here at 7:30 p.m. They're going to double down on this, and I'll get into Clinton's role in that meeting. Double down, absolutely. Ambassador Stevens has been taken hostage. We need to run Con Plan 0300. Now, as we teach our students, you do not take a con plan off the shelf and just run it without going through the joint planning process. You have to actually customize it for your operation. They are not going to do so because in Panetta's mind, he has interpreted the events in Benghazi, Libya as a rerun of a hostage rescue he had run in January of 2012, in which Jessica Buchanan, an American in Somalia, was taken hostage along with a Danish citizen. He ran Con Plan 0300 then. He thinks he's seeing a repeat of the incident. As I'll get into the 7:30 meeting, they're going to double down on that wrongful assumption. And in total, it's going to take 23 hours for the military to respond to the attack. Here's the individual roles. So you can see this is very traditional in the sense it's very stovepiped. There's going to be a natural tendency to turn over the attack response to the military. And so you're going to see Panetta and the combatant commanders doing military type things, issuing orders and sending troops. As I said, they ran Con Plan 0300 without going to the joint planning process, made wrongful assumptions, which turned into risks. As I'll get into, they never had a chance to rescue the Americans in Libya, and those of the CIA annex were never in the rescue plans. Okay, so my hypothesis, several of them here, you're going to focus, as I said, on that rival presidential candidate for the next election. Has absolutely nothing to do with finding the truth. It's simply to drag down the poll number. So then Representative McCarthy at the time, when he said, hey, we've done a good job of dragging down Clinton's poll numbers, he, in my opinion, he was speaking the truth, even if he didn't mean to. A member's role, this is also, as I said, the partisan brand for a member. It's all about increasing their profile, their national image, helping themselves with their chances in office, and probably even advance to a higher office. And then the staff members through this vetting process, and in addition to ensuring the partisan narrative, they're going to be vetted through a party loyalty process, and they're going to give them plum assignments on the actual committee investigation. So what does this look like? in terms of the results from Benghazi, this is just simply Benghazi by the numbers. As you can see here, State Department, in terms of number of witnesses, vast majority of those were State Department. To save you guys the guesswork, Secretary of State Clinton was in charge of the State Department, so there clearly was this hyper focus on Clinton. Not only that, but in terms of the interviews, they were subjected to the longer interviews. In terms of high profile, so Clinton inner circle, more members of the State Department were actually brought in for interviews than any of their agencies. And in terms of staff members that were actually present at those high profile meetings, by far more than any of the other agencies. In terms of which speakers were in this, one of my arguments is the speaker is actually the one running the investigations, not the committee chair. What this looks like under Boehner is simply more of the same. In terms of witness interviews, press releases, and document requests, very much under Boehner, there's this hyper focus on Clinton. Paul Ryan is going to shift it the other direction. In my opinion, is basically to check the box that this is a comprehensive investigation. He's going to shift it away from State Department and back towards the DoD, intelligence community, and the White House. Hey, as I stated, the whole point of an investigation is basically to bring down the poll numbers of your rival. And what this had, the net effect on Clinton was 5 percentage points. This is indirect measure. Comey's going to launch the investigation 2 weeks before the election about Clinton's emails. So it was the discovery of the emails from the Benghazi committee, which actually continued to haunt Clinton up through the 2016 election. The point about the emails, though, is it was not the Benghazi committee that actually found these. It was a New York Times story on March 2nd, 2015. This is going to shift the investigation into hyperdrive. It's going to be all hands on deck to go after Clinton. I don't know if I have the slide for this, but some of the poll numbers will show basically just how much this actually shifted towards Clinton as a result of this New York Times article. Okay, so the question is, what was missed? This seems to be fairly comprehensive. However, who was actually in charge of Libyan policy was not found by the Benghazi committee. Why was the attack blamed on this anti-Islamic video? And then finally, why did the military fail to provide a timely response? If you read the 891 pages of the report, you will not find answers to these questions. And the truth of the matter is this is actually much more complicated than it was made out to be because party loyalists have written a narrative for this. When it comes to Libya, there's a clear divide between Clinton and Obama when it came to what to do there. Obama, and this is referring to Bush 43, don't do stupid stuff. He was very much for the Brent Scowcroft model. He was not into nation building. He did believe that if it was not multilateral and it was not in the U.S. national interest, you should not get involved. In the opposite camp was Clinton, Samantha Power, Susan Rice, and they said, the response to that was don't do stupid stuff is not an organizing principle. They were very much institutionalists. Clinton had what was referred to as smart power. She believed in the diplomatic instrument of national power to achieve nation building. This is not going to be a case where Libya is built from scratch. Clinton and her cohorts believed that Libya's national wealth, its oil wealth, it had the infrastructure in place that they could basically serve an advisory role and build Libya up from scratch into a stable democracy. After the attacks, Clinton is essentially going to be sidelined. Obama's going to take back Libyan policy from the State Department. He's basically going to wash his hands of it. There's an effort to train a national Libyan army that's going to be a disaster. By 2014, basically all U.S. efforts in Libya had been shut down. Now, when it comes to what's referred to as anti-Islamic talking points, something the Republicans make a big deal of this, is why was this attack blamed on a video? We know this to be completely and totally false. This was a well-organized, well-planned terrorist attack. And the fact of the matter is, the slide's a little bit screwed up here, is on the night of the attacks, Mitt Romney is going to punch the Obama administration in the face by saying Obama's soft on terrorism. There's this consensus building that we have to fight back. We have to defend ourselves here. And so at 9:30 p.m., so 2 hours after the, the interagency meeting, Jake Sullivan is going to write talking points that's going to conflate the attack with the anti-Islamic narrative. These talking points, as I said, are written on the night of the attack before the CIA annex is even hit. Ben Rhodes is going to copy those talking points and use those for government officials when they go into the media to talk about blaming it on this anti-Islamic video, including Susan Rice, is going to go on national TV about 5 days later. Comes a huge controversy. Ben Rose's email is going to be released through a FOIA request, and we get our controversy. Now, finally, getting to why did the military take 23 hours to respond? Why was it a failed rescue? As I said, Panetta mistranslated what seems a very, very clear directive. Do everything you can to save American lives. He's going to think in his head, I'm rerunning Somalia, January 2012. He's going to reinterpret that guidance. So this is an operational approach as we teach our students. He's going to reinterpret that end state of saving American lives into regional stability and securing Tripoli. And so in his mind, okay, I've seen hostage rescue. I have to do what I can to save Ambassador Stevens. And then based on this anti-Islamic film, I'm going to have regional instability. I have to prepare for regional instability. I believe it was Jukebox Lotus was the name of the operation, which would run for years. The military is on a contingency for quick responses in the region. The main impetus for this, and this is a great case study on groupthink, is this 7:30 meeting. So I said Panetta is going to soon develop the narrative. This is based on an anti-Islamic video. Ambassador Stevens has been taken hostage. He's going to bring this into the interagency meeting at 7:30 p.m. This meeting is headed by Clinton. Clinton is a senior official. He's at the meeting. She is going to read a note at the meeting saying, yes, DOD, you are absolutely positively correct. Ambassador Stevens has been taken hostage. This is going to lead to a lull in the military response of several hours where they're thinking we're doing the right thing with Comm Plan 0300. We ran this, as I said, in Somalia. We have several days to respond to try to figure out how we're going to rescue Ambassador Stevens. This is all based on a wrongful assumption. As we know in the military, if you make a wrong assumption, you assume the risk. And when you assume the risk, it can lead to mission failure. And so my argument here is there was never, ever a chance to save any of the Americans in Libya. And in fact, these Americans were forced to save themselves. And that's what I have. So 19 minutes. Thank you all very much. Sorry, that was very quick.
Sandy, what questions do we have?
Plenty of comments. Everybody enjoyed it. That's what I'm seeing here. Questions wise, I didn't see anything in the chat. Anybody here have any questions?
I have a question for John about the NPT initiative.
Hey, John.
Hey, how are you? When you were looking at the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, you mentioned the P5 ending up as the 5 nuclear weapon states.
Yeah.
China and France don't accede to the treaty until later. So when you were looking at the Johnson administration, did you have a sense of whether that was like a long-term objective of the United States? There was a recognition that maybe someday China and France would join in, or was that not on their radar 6 years they were pursuing this?
So it was certainly on the radar of the State Department and the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, as well as the UN delegation, as the NPT is sort of enjoying its final negotiation, sort of dotting the I's, crossing the T's, few language changes from like April to June of 1968. China is such an interesting case because, you know, my book kind of charts back the NPT, really kind of have to go back to the Limited Test Ban Treaty. And early on, there was a hope that the Limited Test Ban Treaty would be an arms control, nuclear arms control and disarmament more generally might be an issue area on which Beijing could prove somewhat accommodationist, that it might offer a sort of route to at least lessening tensions, if not taunt, then just, first in the kind of first 2 years of the Kennedy administration, that this didn't necessarily have to be a kind of perpetual antagonism, enmity with Beijing, and that ultimately doesn't bear fruit. By 63, especially following this Indian War, and a sort of like mutual mistrust between New Delhi and Beijing just keeps ratcheting up. The superpowers, and this is kind of where I locate the origins of this kind of Soviet-American effort at condominium, negotiating a limited test ban treaty has these advantages. And you see a number of reports, State Department, ACTA. Well, the great thing about an unverified limited test ban treaty is China doesn't have to sign. We don't have to recognize the regime. It also works for East and West Germany. verification actually makes it more difficult. But it also provides a way for Moscow and Washington to sort of point at Beijing when they do test and say, like, hey, look, they're testing in the atmosphere. That, you know, this is something only a rogue state would do. And so that's a neologism. It's not, you know, the term of art at the time, but you can see even during the Moscow negotiations, there's this kind of game plan that we can almost make common cause with the Soviets, the Warsaw Pact, neutral and non-aligned states as well, and U.S. allies, to more or less call Beijing to account when they do tests, and to provide a counter narrative to, you know, their kind of package deal of no first use and first Asian bomb, things of that nature. So by the time you get to the NPT, you're in the throes of the Cultural Revolution, and so it's sort of ironic that a kind of campaign that really began in many ways to try to deal with a nuclear-armed China by 68, they're sort of an afterthought. Romania, various times in the UN, serves as a kind of proxy for Beijing, and, you know, makes certain points. This is, you know, an atomic condominium, and, you know, really the Moscow and Washington are just kind of, much the same, and are, you know, kind of conspiring together to hold down the third world, in Beijing in particular. France is the really interesting case, because they have an opportunity not to veto the NPT, because that's through the General Assembly, although they do have a considerable amount of clout with various African nations. There's 32 African nations at this point in the General Assembly. So if Africa is not, I don't know, on board, then you're going to have a really tough time getting a positive UNGA vote. But where they do have a veto is the Security Council. And there's this UN Security Council Resolution 255, which in essence, you know, says that permanent members with nuclear weapons on the Security Council have this kind of positive mandate to respond expeditiously in the event of the use or the threat of use of nuclear weapons against a non-nuclear weapon state signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the French, you know, looking through the French files, consider seriously vetoing it because de Gaulle is more or less on principle opposed to any negotiation of nuclear issues that exists or extends beyond the nuclear club, but also because the French Foreign Ministry sees all these ways in which you're going to create new precedents, hierarchy between conventional and nuclear warfare, the idea that the UN Security Council should attack specific problems, the nuclear question, rather than, general problems like all nuclear issues rather than specific problems as they arise. And again, this sort of warrant for preventive war in the name of global nuclear peace. So the French, it's interesting, they acquiesce. That's the way I characterize it. They don't, I believe, join until 96. It might be after the CTBT is finalized but not signed by certain states. So it's a complicated history, but I think there was a notion, especially for Kennedy and parts of the Johnson administration, that the UN system more generally would help kind of re-legitimate American power amid detente, the Sino-Soviet split in the Vietnam War. Thanks. Sorry, it's a great question and a really long answer. So.
Any other questions or comments?
Question. So Dr. Podliiska, you had mentioned, of course, as a librarian, the research aspect of investigations is highly interesting to me. Over the historical time period, has that research function come back, or has it completely?
No. It's only gotten worse.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, I kind of skipped over. So the number of investigations actually increased, but they don't have the research on there. So it simply becomes staff members compiling gotcha questions. And so it's all about the soundbite now for the members. And in order to get yourself elevated as a staff member to get these home assignments is basically to pose that gotcha question for your member that's going to get them into the news cycle. And so one of my recommendations for this is the Congressional Research Service, which was used very effectively while I was there, and also was considered a nonpartisan entity. So it's, for those of you who don't know, it's basically the research arm of Congress. If you have a question, like, you know, what causes inflation in the U.S., you could submit the question to the Congressional Research Service. They come back with academic literature and kind of, very easy to follow breakdown of that. This argument is simply expand that staff if you're not going to have these staff members who are promoted based on party loyalty.
I had a quick question for Hutchinson. So I was curious, kind of the broader frame of this is kind of less of a Cold War narrative of wanting to ease relations with West Germany as, European security becomes, dominated by questions of the threat of the Soviet Union, threat eventually of a proto-Warsaw Pact, versus an internal process where kind of good faith bureaucrats are making decisions on based on their notions of justice, their notions of legal procedure. It could, I wonder if a respondent who's kind of being a Cold War historian myself, and that's definitely the frame in which I've encountered the story before. How would you respond to somebody who would say, well, maybe part of the reason that McCloy was able, or these sort of mid-level, low-level bureaucrats were allowed to make these sort of rather consequential decisions was because at higher levels there wasn't the same concerns, or at higher levels never stepped in because they felt that the West German relationship had become so strategically vital.
Yeah, the structure, it could be both, right? And that's an interesting question about how powers are delegated. So under the Truman administration, all the occupation authorities of the military government, OMGUS, are delegated. When Lucius Clay retires in 1949, they're split into a civilian counterpart and a military counterpart, held through UCOM, Thomas Handy, for all military affairs, and through the State Department exercised by High Commissioner John McCloy and his successors. And the Nuremberg trials were put, even though they were military trials, were put under State Department jurisdiction, whereas the thousands of cases tried by other U.S. military tribunals, like the Dachau cases, the Normandy massacre cases, all that is put under Thomas Handy and UCOM, essentially, to delegate this authority. The State Department is given kind of complete sovereignty. Truman delegates these authorities to the State Department. The State Department delegates them to McCloy. There's not a lot of back and forth on that. So whereas McCloy and State, Secretary of State, and even the President are in contact on unfolding events of a foreign policy nature, like the outbreak of the Korean War, what's actually interesting from the American perspective is how inconsequential the war criminals issue is, right? And this is more of a response to the German historiography on the subject, because for Adenauer and the German state, the war criminals are a high priority issue. For the Americans, they're a low priority issue, which doesn't accord to what you're saying, right? The structure of the Cold War kind of gives this freedom to care about some things and not others. But at the same time, when you look at the justifications for it, it's almost entirely in this idealistic language of fairness and balance. And McCloy and the rest actually, in their statements after the fact, get rather perturbed that anyone would suggest this has anything to do with Korea or any other foreign policy issue. They're like, no, this is internal. This the war criminals issue is segmented off from everything else. And whether or not you believe that that's true, because of course that's what they would say, but they maintain that in the face of constant kind of criticism on the matter. And as a final point, I think that's rather telling, right, is that they don't fully understand how significant this issue is to a lot of folks in Germany and without. And even within Germany, and I really will stop here, there's a tendency to think of the German public opinion as monolithic. We're going to buy German favor by easing up on the war criminal sentences because Germans want this. Well, Germans don't want this. Conservative Germans want this. The Social Democrats are incensed by this decision, right? By making this decision, the U.S. State Department makes no friends in Germany because whatever leniency they give isn't lenient enough for the conservatives, and it's far too lenient for the Social Democrats and others. And it alienates allies and partners all around Western Europe and also in the Soviet Union as well. Not partners, but it alienates the Soviet Union as well. So it's one of these things where they're so focused internally that there are no clear winners from a foreign policy perspective. It's just a poor decision in that sense.
Did McCloy have a JD?
Yeah, he's a lawyer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and these are mostly lawyers. The staff are mostly lawyers.
Yeah.
That's it. No more.
Well, before we wrap this up, we would like to say thank you to our authors, and we have a little something. So, Dr. Hunter, if you come up first. And so this is a certificate of appreciation to thank you for being part of our first Authors Connect. So you have something you put up in your office.
Yeah.
And then also, Justin printed these 3D. So if you've never been to the Innovation Lab, you need to come check it out. And it's the Authors Connect logo And it says on the back, Jonathan Hunt, Authors Connect 2023.
That's awesome.
So pretty cool. So thank you again for presenting.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Shake your hand. I feel like I'm graduating.
So, I'm supposed to pose, I'm sorry, I'm not doing the social thing correctly, so, Dr. Hutchinson,
This is super cool. Thank you.
you're welcome, so same deal. So, do you want me to pose this time? So
Yeah.
you can hold this.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so
Last but not least, Dr. Podliiska. So, here's your 3D printed memento and your certificate.
Yay.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
And again, this wraps this up. Again, if you have any research or would like to come and speak with us, please reach out. We would love to have you and connect AU with research and publications. So thank you for coming today.